Historians note, Ascenti Reconciliation Archive, Year 3 Post-Armistice. The following is a transcribed testimony from former War Marshal Asen Vray of the Dravesk Line, recorded voluntarily as part of the Joint Reconciliation Project. It has been translated with minimal alteration to preserve the Marshal's own words. I want to begin by telling you what my instructors taught me, because you will not understand how badly we misjudged your species until you understand exactly how certain we were that we could not be wrong. The Ascenti Dominion built its entire military doctrine across 900 years and 41 campaigns on a single unbending principle. A soldier who retreats has already lost, regardless of what the battlefield's actual outcome eventually proves. We called it Varith's Reckoning, after the general who first codified it during our unification wars, and it was not merely tactical wisdom to us. It was closer to scripture. A commander who ordered a withdrawal was, at minimum, relieved of command in disgrace. A soldier who fell back without direct order was executed, cleanly and without ceremony, because we believed, with the total unexamined certainty of a civilization that had never once been seriously tested on the point, that retreat was not a maneuver at all. It was surrender wearing a more comfortable name. I commanded the Dravesk Line for 6 years before your species ever entered Ascenti space, and I want you to understand I was good at my work. I had broken 4 separate rebellions using nothing but the doctrine I had been raised on. Hold the ground. Never yield the ground. Let the enemy break themselves against you, because a wall does not need to be clever, it only needs to refuse to move. It had never once failed me. I saw no reason, when the reports of your species' first defensive engagements began reaching my desk, to believe it ever would. The first reports described your forces abandoning a fortified position on the moon your species called Asheville Reach after less than 6 hours of engagement, falling back nearly 40 kilometers under what our own scouts described as remarkably disciplined cover fire. My staff officers were, I confess, almost gleeful reading it. Here at last was the proof we had been waiting for, that this new species, whatever cleverness it had shown in its ships and its weapons, lacked the one quality that had let the Dominion outlast every enemy it had ever faced: resolve. We wrote reports back to the capital using words like fragile and undisciplined, and I am ashamed now to recall how easily the word came to my own pen: cowardly. It took me 11 more engagements to understand how completely I had misread what I was looking at. Colonel Talia Bronson commanded the human defensive sector along what your forces called the Kelvara Line, and I did not learn her name until nearly a year into the campaign, because for the first 10 months of that war, I genuinely believed I was fighting an enemy who simply could not hold ground. Every engagement followed what I had, by then, begun privately calling the pattern, though I had not yet understood it was a pattern at all rather than a series of unrelated failures. Your forces would meet us at a defensible position, inflict what my own casualty reports described, with a precision that should have troubled me far more than it did, as disproportionate losses relative to engagement duration, and then withdraw, always in good order, always covering their own wounded, always falling back to a second prepared position that seemed to already be waiting for them. I did not ask myself in those first 10 months why a position always seemed to be waiting. I was too busy counting the ground I believed I was winning. The Battle of the Asheville Corridor is the engagement my own officers still study, those few of us willing to study anything from that war honestly at all. Your Colonel Bronson held the corridor's outer defensive ring for 4 days against a force that outnumbered her own nearly 3-to-1, inflicting losses my command staff privately estimated at close to a third of my advancing formation's total strength. And then, on the 5th day, with the position still tactically holdable by any reasonable measure, she ordered a full withdrawal. I remember the moment the report reached me with an exactness that I suspect will stay with me for the rest of my life. I stood in my command tent, reading the transmission, and I laughed. I actually laughed in front of my staff, because it seemed in that moment like the clearest confirmation yet of everything Vareth's reckoning had ever taught me. A commander who had just won 4 days of costly, grinding advantage, abandoning the ground for no reason any Ascenti officer could identify. I ordered a full pursuit within the hour. I will admit to you honestly now, to see it. I wanted to watch the retreat become a rout, because some old, ugly part of me needed the proof, needed to see with my own eyes that everything I had built my career on was still true. We advanced 18 kilometers into the corridor before the ground itself began working against us in ways my engineers had never accounted for. The terrain Colonel Bronson had abandoned was not, I came to understand far too late, simply ground. It was a corridor she had spent 4 days deliberately shaping, mapping every choke point, seeding every ridge line with sensor arrays her retreating forces had left disguised as battlefield debris, drawing my entire advancing formation, eager and overextended and utterly convinced we were chasing a broken enemy, directly into a kill zone she had been quietly preparing since before the engagement had even begun. The counterattack came from 3 directions at once, precisely coordinated, precisely timed, and it did not merely stop my advance. It broke it entirely. I lost more of my formation in the 11 hours that followed than I had lost across the entire previous 4 days of what I had, until that moment, considered a costly but ultimately successful engagement. Colonel Bronson's retreating forces, the ones I had ordered pursued as a broken, cowardly rabble, turned out to have never been broken at all. They had simply finished the first half of a plan that required my own overconfidence to complete the second half for her. I want to be precise about what I felt, standing in the wreckage of that pursuit, because I think it matters more than the tactical details themselves. It was not merely defeat. Ascenti officers had tasted defeat before, in smaller engagements across 900 years of history, and defeat alone had never once shaken the doctrine underneath it. What shook me was the sudden, vertiginous understanding that I had spent 10 months mistaking discipline for weakness, simply because it did not look like the discipline I had been taught to recognize. Your species had built an entire different architecture of courage, one that measured itself not by how much ground a soldier refused to yield, but by how precisely, how patiently, how completely a soldier was willing to give ground up in service of a plan larger than their own pride in holding it. It required, I came to understand far too slowly, a kind of restraint that struck me, even in defeat, as considerably harder to sustain than simply standing still and dying where you were told to stand. I requested a formal ceasefire meeting 6 weeks after the Asheville corridor, in no small part because my own command staff, watching me for the first time question a doctrine none of us had ever questioned before, had begun to fracture along lines I did not yet have the authority to heal. Colonel Bronson attended the meeting herself, which surprised me. I had expected a diplomat, someone trained in the particular careful language such meetings usually require. Instead, I found a tired, plainly dressed woman roughly my own age, sitting across a folding table in a tent that smelled of rain and scorched metal, who looked at me with an expression I initially misread as contempt, and only much later understood was something closer to weary recognition. "You want to know why we kept falling back," she said, before I had even finished my prepared opening statement, because she had clearly guessed, correctly, that the question underneath everything I intended to say was the only one that actually mattered to either of us. I would find that useful, I admitted. Every army we've ever fought that doesn't understand tactical withdrawal makes the exact same mistake you made, she said, and there was no cruelty in the observation, only the flat tiredness of someone repeating a lesson she had clearly delivered before, to other enemies in other wars on a world I had never seen and would likely never visit. You think ground is the thing worth dying for. We think soldiers are the thing worth dying for, and ground is just where we happen to be standing while we figure out how to keep as many of them alive as the mission allows. Those aren't the same math, Marshall. And an army that's only ever done the first kind of math is always going to read the second kind as cowardice, right up until the day it very expensively learns otherwise. Your colonel abandoned a position her forces had bled 4 days to hold, I said, still, even then, not quite ready to fully release the doctrine I had built my entire career on. She held it exactly as long as holding it was useful, Bronson said. And then she let it go, because the position was never actually the objective. Breaking your formation's confidence enough that it would chase a retreat without checking what it was chasing into, that was the objective. The ground was bait the whole time, Marshall. It was never a wall we were trying to be. We built it to look like one because we needed you to believe completely that it was, right up until the moment believing that cost you everything. She was quiet a moment, studying me with an expression that had, by then, fully shed whatever coldness I'd first read into it. I'm not gonna pretend it's an easy thing to teach, what we do. Every soldier under my command has had to learn to swallow the exact same instinct yours have, the one that screams at you to hold ground because giving it up feels like losing. Doesn't matter how many times I explain the math to a scared 19-year-old holding a position under fire. In the moment, falling back always feels like failure. We just train our people, over and over, until the feeling stops being in charge of the decision. That's the whole secret, Marshall, if you want it plainly. It was never about not caring whether we won or lost ground. It was about deciding, a long time before the battle ever started, that living soldiers and a completed plan mattered more than a line on a map that was never gonna hold any meaning at all once the war was actually over. I did not fully believe her, not completely, not that day. 900 years of doctrine does not unmake itself across a single conversation in a rain-damp tent, however honest the conversation. But I asked before the meeting closed whether her forces would be willing to run a joint training exercise with a small unit of my own officers, a request that violated at least 4 separate protocols I would have enforced without hesitation only 2 months earlier, and she agreed, and that exercise became the first of 11, and those 11 became, over the following year, the foundation of what the Dominion now calls the Bronson Reforms, though I suspect she would tell you, with the same tired honesty she showed me in that tent, that she never wanted a doctrine named after her at all. I retired from active command 4 years ago, not entirely by choice, because an officer who publicly recants the doctrine he built his career defending does not generally retain the confidence of the officers who still believe in it. I do not regret the recanting. I regret, more than I suspect I will ever fully stop regretting, the 11 months and the several thousand Ascenti soldiers it cost me to learn a lesson your Colonel Bronson had clearly already learned, hard, somewhere in her own species' long and difficult history, long before she ever met me. I keep, in what remains of my personal effects, a single line from the after-action report she filed following the Asheville corridor engagement, translated into Ascenti by a linguist who told me, when I asked her to render it as precisely as possible, that the original human idiom did not translate cleanly, that something in its particular economy was lost no matter how carefully she worked. I have read it more times than I could count in the years since, and I find that even imperfectly translated, it says more about what your species actually is than every report my own intelligence division filed across the entire war combined. Sometimes the bravest thing an army can do, she wrote, is know exactly when to run, and run anyway on purpose toward a plan instead of away from a fear. I was a soldier for 31 years before I understood what that sentence meant. I have spent the 4 years since trying to make sure the officers who serve under whatever remains of my reputation understand it a great deal faster than I did. That is my testimony. I do not offer it as an excuse for what my forces did in service of a doctrine I now recognize as badly, dangerously mistaken. I offer it only because I was asked to explain honestly how a civilization as old and as proud as mine came to call your species cowards, and I have found in the years since that war ended that the only honest answer available to me is the simplest one. We called you cowards because we had never once needed to learn the difference between fleeing a fight and finishing one, and your species, long before it ever met mine, already had.